There's always an ounce of truth in every conspiracy theory. You're watching Making Sense with Robbie? Let's get started. If you were to talk about chemtrails or weather manipulation, most people would say, that's not true, that's not real. They just dismiss it as a conspiracy theory. But there was a 1974 article in the New York Times that talked about how weather manipulation was used during the Vietnam War. So this is a real thing. It's proven. It's like in the New York Times, the most reliable newspaper in the world. And it's talking about how weather manipulation was a thing that was done by the government to try and influence the outcome of a war. And so it is a real thing. But because it's called a conspiracy theory, most people just write it off and don't take it seriously. But the thing is that conspiracy theories always come from an ounce of truth. There's always some truth at the center. There's some truth at the core of it. There's something that actually happened that's provable, that's factual, that's evidence-based. And then there's sort of a story that comes out of it that's sort of narrative-based. That might not necessarily come from the facts. But there always is like some truth. There's always some fact to every conversation, to every conspiracy theory. Maybe not to everyone. Again, like once it gets extended, once like a story or a narrative comes into it, that's kind of where it becomes a conspiracy theory. That's where it sort of slips away from being evidence-based truth. But that's not necessarily where people draw the line. A lot of times people will just say that something's not true because it doesn't feel right to them, or because they don't believe it, or because it's not something they heard about before. And so they might dismiss it for that reason. If you are hearing or learning about a conspiracy theory, you might notice that there's a certain line where it sort of loses its basis in reality and becomes something different. And a good example of this is like the famous clip where Alex Jones says, "And it's turning the frogs gay." And while that's not exactly true, there is an article in Scientific America that does talk about how a very common pesticide that was being used was actually changing the gender of frogs. And so while what Alex Jones was saying was a sensationalized representation of it, and he said it in kind of like a hysterical way, it actually was based on the truth. Like it is actually a true thing. When you hear it kind of in the way that he says it, or you kind of hear it in the context of where he's saying it, then it seems like it's sensational nonsense. But often like when you have a story, when you have an event and you're describing it, to add intentionality to it, or to say that this happened for some reason or was influenced by someone, that makes it harder to prove, because it's really difficult to prove intentionality. Even if intentionality seems really obvious and very likely, it's hard to prove that. There's not going to be very much effort from, let's say, the more reputable news sources to prove a lot of conspiracy theories true or false, because like there's no incentive to tell those sorts of stories. A lot of times we want life to sort of maintain the status quo and for things to stay the same and for no one to question anything, and just to sort of generally accept that the world is a fair place and that there's no manipulation going on anywhere. But we all know that's not true. But then again, like separating coincidence, cause and effect from intentionality is also difficult, because a lot of times cause and effect will look like intentionality. And in a sense, they kind of are intentionality, but they're not intentionality. Like people take certain actions because of the circumstances they find themselves in, and they don't really have a choice sometimes. While it might be very obvious from like the sort of outside observer, it's hard to prove, and it's hard to prove that it wasn't just a coincidence, or that it wasn't just the result of cause and effect outside of the control of the person who took the action. But it kind of makes sense why this would happen, right? Because like people always create some narrative. They always tell a story when they're sharing information. And there's always like some truth to that. Like there's always something they're trying to tell you, but they have to like exaggerate, maybe they have to elaborate on things, they have to hold back on other things. To tell a story, you need to create some narrative, and that sort of makes that story more interesting, that makes it more engaging, it makes it more something that people want to hear about. By doing that, you're kind of moving away from the truth, you're moving away from the facts. And while that's a good way to share a story, that's a good way to share information, it is by necessity kind of getting away from the truth. And clearly not all conspiracy theories are true. Probably most of them aren't true, but there are definitely true ones out there. But even for the stories that are like radically untrue, there's always an ounce of truth. There's always some facts in there that are actually based on reality, that are actually based on the truth. And that the story is a sort of an exaggeration for whatever reason to influence people's thoughts, most likely, but also politically motivated or financially motivated or power motivated. But there is something true about them. They're not completely false. It's not like these just ideas come from nowhere, right? Like this is the whole idea. They come from somewhere. But if this explanation is true, that all sort of stories stem from some true facts, then like what does that say about the sort of mainstream stories, the ones that are presented on the news? And I would say like it's the same thing. Like it's the same thing as a conspiracy theory. It's just not called a conspiracy theory. It's called like the news. It's called the truth. But like what usually happens is that you have this event and then you have a story or a narrative that's created so that this event can be explained. And like while that is important for storytelling and engagement and getting people to read and consume and keep on paying attention, it is always taking away from the truth of the matter. It's always taking away from the facts. And so this is like what seems to be happening all the time, whether it's a conspiracy or whether it's the mainstream news. It's like there's always some truth to what's being said, but it's not all true. Like the story itself becomes untrue by like kind of making it a story or by telling it as a story. And you could say there's varying degrees of truth and falseness to these stories, but like it all basically becomes the same thing in the end. It's all about like transferring ideas, trying to influence the way that people think about things, and trying to control their behavior or push them in one direction or another. And it doesn't really matter like who is doing this or where it's coming from, because the intention seems to always be the same. What you should take away from this is that the news or conspiracy theories, they're always based on an ounce of truth. There's always something true in that story, and there's also other stuff that's not true. There's also like narrative that's there for reasons that are different than sort of telling you the truth. What are we supposed to make of the information that we have? Like, how are we supposed to come to conclusions? Like, how are we supposed to know if what we believe is justified? Because it's always hard to know like where the truth ends and where the story begins. So let me know in the comments below what you think. Do you think that there's truth in conspiracy theories? Do you think that there's truth in the news? If you found this entertaining or informative, click that like button because I'd really appreciate it. If you are curious about learning how to think about things but you don't want to be told what to think about them, then click that subscribe button because that's what I'm here for. You've been watching Making Sense with Robbie. Thanks for watching and we'll talk next time. Goodbye.